I froze mid-step when I saw Lucan Oren, the blind millionaire I worked for, holding a tablet with footage that was never meant for anyone to see. I was standing at the edge of the grand hall, my fingers gripping a silver serving tray so hard they turned white. The room was filled with the sound of laughter, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that felt warm or friendly. It was sharp and mean, the kind of sound people make when they think they have finally won a game that nobody else knew they were playing. Lucan sat in his expensive leather chair, his eyes staring straight ahead as they always did, appearing vacant and sightless. But his hands were steady as he held the device. Around him, his family members, his sister, his cousins, and his cruel aunt crowded closer. They were smirking, looking at the screen as if it were a hilarious comedy special rather than a recording of a human being's private life. To them, I was just the maid who tries too hard, a punchline to a joke they had been telling for months. They didn't see me standing in the shadows of the doorway. They thought I was in the kitchen, or perhaps scrubbing a floor in a distant wing of the mansion. In their eyes, I was invisible. I had always been invisible to them, a ghost in a black and white uniform who moved through their lives without ever leaving a mark. But in that moment, as I watched them watch the footage, everything changed. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I knew exactly what was on that tablet. It wasn't just a video of me working. It was the evidence of a secret Lucan thought he had buried deep beneath his charity events and business meetings. It was proof of serious fraud, of a family that ignored crimes and manipulated every employee who dared to look them in the eye. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, followed by a sudden, burning heat of anger. My name is Juna Barrett. For months, I had been the silent observer, the girl who polished the silver while listening to the rot inside the walls of this house. They thought I was powerless because I was poor. They thought I was stupid because I served them. As I watched Lucan's smirk grow wider, I whispered a promise to myself under my breath. "They'll regret thinking I'm powerless," I said, my voice barely a breath. The story of how I ended up in this house was long, but the story of how I would take it down was just beginning. The first day I arrived at the Oren mansion, I knew I was entering a different world, but I didn't realize it was a world where I didn't exist. From the very first moment, Lucan's family treated me like a ghost. I remember walking through the massive front doors, my small suitcase in hand, feeling the weight of the marble and the height of the ceilings. I was desperate for the job, but the air in the house felt heavy and cold, even though the sun was shining outside. Lucan's sister, Alara, was the first one to speak to me, and she didn't even look at my face. She pointed a manicured finger at my shoes and told me to never let them click on the hardwood floors again. They mocked my background, laughing about the little town I came from as if it were a place where people didn't have souls. I was ordered around like a machine. I cleaned the baseboards with a toothbrush, cooked meals that were sent back because the parsley was too green, and served wine to people who acted like I was a piece of furniture. Every misstep I made was scrutinized. If a single grain of dust was found on a picture frame, I was threatened with termination. They loved the power they held over me. They knew I needed the money to support myself, and they used that need like a leash. Lucan himself was the most confusing. He was a millionaire who had lost his sight in an accident years ago, or so the story went. He sat in the center of the chaos, quiet and regal, while his family swirled around him like vultures. I spent my days moving from room to room, keeping my head down and my mouth shut. I learned to blend into the wallpaper. I learned that if you stay quiet enough, people forget you have ears. They start to say things they shouldn't. They start to act like their true selves because they don't think a simple maid could ever understand the complexity of their lives. One afternoon, while I was polishing the heavy oak doors of the library, the door was slightly ajar. I heard voices inside, hushed, urgent, and filled with a tension that made the hair on my arms stand up. I stopped moving, my cloth poised over the wood. I overheard a conversation that made my stomach turn. It was a secret no outsider was ever supposed to know, a conversation about numbers that didn't add up and people who had been taken care of to keep them quiet. That was the first time I realized that the Oren family wasn't just wealthy, they were dangerous. After that day at the library door, I couldn't look at the Oren family the same way again. Every time I saw them hosting a charity gala or smiling for a local newspaper photographer, I felt a wave of nausea. I realized that the entire family was hiding shady deals and massive fraud behind their public smiles. Every event they held was a stage performance. The kind donations they made were just smoke and mirrors to distract people from the money they were stealing from their own partners and employees. Each smile they gave to the public was a mask. Behind closed doors, the masks fell off. I watched as they laughed about how easy it was to trick the common people. I saw the way they treated the junior staff, firing anyone who asked too many questions about the books. Fear and anger began to mingle inside me, creating a fire that I had to hide under my professional exterior. I was just a maid, but I had something they didn't realize. I had access to every room in the house. My curiosity began to grow. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about the truth. I started to pay closer attention to the things they left behind. I looked at the papers in the trash cans and the post-it notes left on desks. I noticed that for a family that claimed to be so charitable, they spent a lot of time talking about offshore movements and erasing trails. I knew I was taking a risk. If they caught me snooping, I wouldn't just lose my job. I might lose much more. But the more I saw of their cruelty, the less I cared about the danger. I began to watch more closely. I started to record things in my mind: who visited the house at 2:00 a.m., which files were kept in the locked cabinet in the study, and how Lucan's blindness seemed to only apply when it was convenient for him to ignore what was happening around him. One night, while the family was out at yet another party, I found myself standing in front of the study door. My heart was racing. I knew there was more to find, more proof of the rot that lived in this mansion. My curiosity was no longer a choice. It was a mission. I decided then that I would record everything I could, all in secret, until I had enough to break their masks forever. The first real discovery happened on a rainy Tuesday. The family was busy preparing for a massive business dinner, and the house was a whirlwind of activity. I was assigned to clean the private office, a room that was usually off-limits to everyone except Lucan and his personal assistant. I knew this was my chance. While I pretended to dust the bookshelves, I kept my eyes peeled for anything that looked out of place. Tucked behind a row of old law books, I found a leather-bound folder. Inside were hidden financial statements and encrypted messages that looked like they belonged in a spy movie. As I scanned the pages, my breath hitched. These weren't just standard business papers. They were logs of payments to people I had never heard of, huge sums of money labeled as consultation fees that clearly looked like hush money. The documents showed how Lucan's family manipulated their employees and business partners without any fear of consequence. They were moving money through accounts that didn't exist on the public record. They were intentionally bankrupting smaller companies they had partnered with just to absorb their assets. It was cold, calculated, and completely illegal. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the proof I needed. I didn't have a phone on me. We weren't allowed to carry them while working, so I began to scribble notes on a small pad I kept in my pocket. I wrote down account numbers, names, and dates. I was so focused on the task that I didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway. The floorboards in the Oren mansion usually didn't creak, but a slight change in the air pressure told me I wasn't alone. I quickly shoved the folder back into its hiding place and turned around, my heart pounding in my ears. Standing in the doorway was Lucan's cousin, Marcus. He was leaning against the frame, a strange look on his face. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me with narrow eyes. I felt like a deer caught in headlights. He noticed me taking notes, or at least he noticed the way I was fumbling with my pocket. The silence stretched between us, thick and terrifying. I wondered if this was the moment it all ended. Marcus didn't report me immediately, which was a surprise, but the tension in the house reached a new level. A few days later, Lucan himself called me into the drawing room. He was sitting by the fireplace, the orange light reflecting off his glasses. He looked calm, almost peaceful, but I knew better than to trust appearances in this house. He asked me to sit down, which was unusual. Normally, I was expected to stand until my legs ached. He began to speak in a soft, low voice. He pretended kindness, asking me how I was settling in and if the work was too hard. For a moment, he almost sounded like a normal employer, but then his voice dropped an octave, becoming cold and sharp. "Careful, Juna, curiosity can get you fired," he warned, his sightless eyes seemingly boring into my soul. His tone chilled me to the bone. It was a direct threat wrapped in a velvet glove. He knew I had been looking for things I shouldn't have seen. He was letting me know that he was watching me, even if he couldn't see me. The irony wasn't lost on me, but the fear was very real. However, instead of making me want to run away, his threat only strengthened my resolve. If he was this worried about a maid, it meant I was onto something huge. I realized I couldn't keep my notes on my person anymore. If they searched me, I would be finished. After I was dismissed from the drawing room, I went to my small, cramped quarters in the servants' wing. I needed a hiding place, somewhere they would never think to look. The Oren family thought of me as a simpleton, so I used that to my advantage. I found a loose floorboard under my bed, but that felt too obvious. Instead, I tucked the notes inside an old, hollowed-out book I had brought from home, a book they had laughed at because it was cheap trash. I then hid that book inside a bag of old cleaning rags in the back of the supply closet. It was a place only I had a reason to access. As I walked away from the closet, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The game was on, and I wasn't going to lose. The cruelty of the Oren family wasn't just directed at me. It was a fundamental part of how they treated everyone they considered beneath them. One afternoon, I was cleaning the windows in the sunroom when I witnessed a scene that made my blood boil. One of the older kitchen servants, a woman named Martha who had worked for the family for years, had accidentally dropped a porcelain saucer. It was an honest mistake, the kind anyone could make. Lucan's aunt, Regina, descended on the poor woman like a hawk. She berated her in front of the other staff, calling her useless and senile. The insults were personal and vicious, designed to strip away Martha's dignity. Regina didn't just want an apology, she wanted to see Martha crumble. Later that evening, I passed by the private lounge and heard Regina and Alara laughing privately about the look on Martha's face. They joked about their power, talking about how fun it was to see the help squirm. They had no idea I was just outside the door. This time, I was ready. I had managed to smuggle my phone into my apron pocket, and I recorded their laughter discreetly. The sound of their high-pitched giggles over a woman's tears was the most disgusting thing I had ever heard. It was more evidence of their character, or lack thereof. I knew that the world needed to see who these people really were behind their expensive jewelry and polished manners. However, being a spy is a dangerous profession. As I was pulling my phone back into my pocket, I turned around to find Alara's personal assistant, a man named Simon, watching me from the end of the hall. He didn't say anything, but the way his eyes lingered on my hands made my heart stop. He had a reputation for being the family's eyes and ears among the staff. I tried to act natural, smoothing down my apron and walking past him with a polite nod. But I could feel his gaze on my back. One family member, or at least their inner circle, was starting to suspect I knew much more than I let on. The walls were starting to close in, and I knew I had to move faster before they caught me in the act. The atmosphere in the mansion became suffocating. I felt like I was being watched at every turn. My fears were confirmed when a fellow staff member, a girl named Sophie who I thought was a friend, betrayed me. I had dropped a small hint to her about the financial papers I'd seen, hoping she might have seen something too. Instead, she reported my interest in the files directly to Lucan. I was summoned once again to Lucan's study. This time, the kindness was gone. The air in the room was electric with tension. Lucan sat behind his desk, his hands steepled. He told me that he had heard I was asking questions that didn't concern me. He gave me a tense, final warning. He told me that if he heard my name mentioned in relation to secrets, ever again, I would find myself on the street without a reference and with a reputation he would personally destroy. Despite the fear threatening to choke me, I stayed calm. I stood there, looking at the man who thought he owned me, and I didn't blink. I apologized for any misunderstanding and promised to focus only on my work. Inside, however, I was collecting evidence silently. Every word he spoke was just more proof of his manipulative nature. I was no longer just a victim, I was a hunter. As I turned to leave, Lucan's voice stopped me at the door. "Be careful, Juna," he said, his voice a low hiss. "I trust no one." The words felt like a death threat, but they also revealed his greatest weakness. He was paranoid. He knew that his empire was built on lies, and he knew that lies are fragile. He was afraid, and that gave me power. I went back to my work, moving like a robot. I cleaned, I served, and I watched. I began to realize that I couldn't trust anyone in the house, not even the other servants. I was completely on my own, but being alone meant that no one could give me away if I was careful enough. I doubled down on my efforts, making sure that every piece of evidence I gathered was backed up and hidden in multiple locations. The betrayal had hurt, but it had also taught me the most important lesson of all. In a house of lies, the only person you can trust is yourself. The Oren family's annual charity gala was the biggest event of the year. Hundreds of wealthy donors, local politicians, and journalists would descend on the mansion to celebrate the family's generosity. It was the perfect cover for their darkest deeds. I knew this would be my best chance to get the evidence I needed to truly bring them down. While the guests were drinking expensive champagne and listening to a live orchestra in the ballroom, I was assigned to keep the refreshments flowing in the private library. During the height of the gala, I spotted Regina and Marcus entering a small side room with a stack of folders. My heart skipped a beat. I followed them as closely as I dared, keeping out of sight behind the heavy velvet curtains. Through a crack in the door, I saw them. They weren't just looking at documents, they were destroying them. They were feeding pages into a high-end shredder and burning others in the fireplace. I could see the words, account audit and investigation, on some of the headers before they vanished into the flames. My hands shook as I realized what I was seeing. This was the physical proof of their cover-up. I knew I had to act. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, making sure the flash was off and the sound was muted. With my cameras rolling, I captured their manipulations without anyone noticing. I filmed the shredder whirring, the papers burning, and the cold, focused expressions on their faces as they erased their crimes. I felt a mix of terror and triumph. If I could get this footage out, they were finished. Just as I was about to retreat, I heard Marcus speak. "The new maid," he said, his voice low. "She's been hanging around the offices a lot lately." Regina paused, a half-burned paper in her hand. "She might actually be smarter than we thought," she replied with a sneer. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. They were onto me. I stayed perfectly still, praying the shadows would keep me hidden. I had the evidence, but now the challenge was getting out of the room without being caught. After the gala, the house felt like a ticking time bomb. I spent every spare moment I had reviewing the footage and notes I had gathered. The scale of the deception was even worse than I had imagined. I discovered fake donations where money was given to charities only to be kicked back to the family through secret offshore accounts. I found records of coerced employee contracts where staff were forced to sign away their rights under threat of legal action. The Oren family truly thought no one could prove anything. They had spent years building a labyrinth of lies that they thought was impenetrable. They believed their wealth made them gods, and gods don't have to answer to anyone. But they had forgotten one thing. Gods are only powerful as long as people believe in them. I was about to stop believing. I began planning the exposure. I knew I couldn't just go to the local police. The Orens had friends in high places, and the evidence might disappear before it ever reached a courtroom. I needed a plan that was airtight. I needed to hit them from all sides, the law, the press, and their social circles. I wanted to see their reputation crumble as quickly as their bank accounts. I started organizing my evidence into files. I made copies of the videos and documents and stored them on cloud drives with passwords that only I knew. I even mailed a physical USB drive to a PO box I had set up in a different city, just in case they found my phone. I was becoming a strategist, thinking 3 steps ahead of people who thought I was barely capable of following a recipe. The pressure was immense. I was living a double life, playing the role of the obedient, invisible maid by day and the meticulous whistleblower by night. Every time Lucan looked in my direction, I wondered if he could sense the rebellion in my heart. I was no longer afraid of him. I was disgusted by him. The countdown to their downfall had begun, and I was the one holding the clock. A week after the gala, Lucan did something I didn't expect. He called me into his office and offered me a promotion. He told me he was impressed by my discretion and hard work, and he wanted me to become his personal house manager. It was a position that came with a significant raise and more responsibility. I knew exactly what it was, a test of loyalty. He wanted to see if I could be bought. He thought that by giving me a little more money and a fancier title, I would become one of them. He thought my silence had a price. I stood there, looking at him, and for the first time, I felt pity. He was so trapped in his own greed that he couldn't imagine anyone having actual integrity. I refused the offer silently, keeping my recordings safe and my expression neutral. I told him I was happy in my current role and didn't feel ready for such a big change. It was a lie, of course, but it was the only way to keep him at arm's length. I didn't want his blood money, and I certainly didn't want to be any closer to his inner circle than I already was. Lucan noticed my refusal immediately. He didn't get angry, which was even scarier. Instead, he just smirked, sensing my defiance. It was a look that said, "So, you've chosen the hard way." The air in the room turned ice cold. I knew that by turning down the promotion, I had officially marked myself as an enemy. I wasn't just a maid anymore, I was a threat that needed to be managed. As I left the office, I felt a strange sense of relief. The lines were drawn. There was no more pretending, at least not for me. I knew that from this moment on, they would be looking for any excuse to get rid of me. I had to be perfect. No mistakes, no late arrivals, no broken dishes. I had to be the best maid they had ever had, while I worked to become the worst nightmare they ever encountered. I knew I needed something bigger, something undeniable. I needed to hear them admit to their crimes in their own voices. I decided to take the ultimate risk. I bought a small, high-tech hidden camera online, using a fake name and having it delivered to a nearby locker. It was tiny, no bigger than a button, and I knew exactly where to put it. The private study was where the family held their most honest conversations. It was the heart of the mansion's darkness. One morning, while I was deep cleaning the room, I installed the camera inside a small decorative clock on the mantelpiece. It had a perfect view of the entire room, and it was connected to my phone via a secure, encrypted app. Every meeting they had from now on would be recorded as proof of their fraud. Later that day, as I was leaving the study, a staff member named Arthur, an older man who usually kept to himself, stopped me in the hallway. He looked around to make sure we were alone, then leaned in close. "I know what you're doing, Juna," he whispered. My heart nearly stopped. "If they catch you, it's over. They don't just fire people here, they ruin them." I looked into his eyes and saw a mixture of fear and respect. He didn't want to report me. He was trying to save me. I realized then that I wasn't the only one who hated this family. There were others who had seen the same things I had but were too afraid to act. His warning was a reminder of the stakes. One slip-up, one discovery of that camera, and my life as I knew it would be finished. Despite the warning, I didn't take the camera down. I couldn't. I had already come too far. That night, I sat in my room and watched the first feed from the study. I saw Lucan, Regina, and Marcus sitting around the table, laughing as they discussed how to reroute another $2 million from the charity's fund. Hearing them talk so casually about theft made my stomach churn. It was exactly what I needed. I had them. As the days passed, the Oren family began to change their tactics. They realized that their threats and bribes weren't working, so they turned to something much more sinister: emotional blackmail. They started dropping hints about my family back home, mentioning things they couldn't have known unless they had been digging into my past. They hinted at public humiliation, suggesting they could make it look like I was the one stealing from them. They were trying to break my spirit. They wanted me to feel like I was the criminal, not them. They wanted me to live in a constant state of terror, waiting for the moment they would destroy my reputation. But they had underestimated me. I had lived through hard times before, and I knew how to stand my ground. I kept calm, realizing that fear can't control me anymore. Their words were just noise, meant to distract me from the truth. The more they tried to blackmail me, the more I realized how desperate they were. They were throwing everything they had at me because they were terrified of what I might know. It was a classic bully move. If you can't silence someone, you try to make them look crazy or untrustworthy. I stayed focused on my goal, knowing that the truth was my greatest shield. My recordings grew in importance with every passing day. I captured conversations about tax evasion, labor violations, and even a plan to frame a local business rival for a crime he didn't commit. Each video was another nail in their coffin. I felt like a collector, gathering every piece of evidence until the picture was complete. The house felt like a battlefield, but I was the one with the superior intelligence. I knew where all the traps were, and I knew how to avoid them. I continued to perform my duties with a smile, even when I wanted to scream. I was a maid, a servant, and a ghost, but I was also the person who was going to take down an empire, and I was going to do it with their own words. Just when I thought I was completely alone in my mission, I found an unexpected ally. One of the junior accountants for the Oren estate, a young man named Leo, approached me while I was cleaning the hallway outside the finance office. He looked nervous, his eyes darting back and forth. He handed me a small, unmarked envelope and whispered, "Use this. They shouldn't be allowed to get away with it." Inside the envelope were insider files that confirmed everything I had recorded. They were copies of the real bank statements, not the fake ones they showed the public. They showed a clear trail of money moving from the charity to private accounts in the Cayman Islands. Leo had been working there for 6 months and had seen enough to know that the Orens were monsters. Lucan and his family remained completely unaware that one of their own was helping me. They were so focused on watching me that they didn't realize the rot was spreading within their own staff. Having the physical documents to back up my video evidence was the final piece of the puzzle. It turned my he said, she said story into a solid legal case. As I studied the files, I realized that the scale of their deception was far larger than I had ever imagined. They weren't just stealing a few $1,000s here and there. They were laundering tens of millions. They were involved in international fraud schemes that spanned 3 continents. The Oren family wasn't just a local problem. They were a global criminal enterprise disguised as a wealthy dynasty. I felt a weight settle on my shoulders. This was no longer just about my revenge or the dignity of the staff. This was about stopping people who were hurting thousands of others. The stakes had been raised, and the pressure was higher than ever. But I wasn't afraid. With Leo's files and my recordings, I had everything I needed to finish this. The Orens thought they were untouchable, but they were about to find out how quickly a mountain can turn into dust. Despite my careful planning, I had a very close call that almost ruined everything. I was in the study, trying to adjust the hidden camera's angle after a cleaning crew had moved some furniture. Suddenly, I heard the heavy click of the door lock. I barely had time to pull my hand back before Lucan walked into the room. He didn't say anything at first, but he stopped exactly where I was standing. Even though he was blind, he had an incredible sense of hearing and awareness. He almost discovered my hidden camera right then and there. He stood just inches away from the clock, his head tilted as if he were listening to the electronics inside. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. I stayed composed, forcing my breathing to stay slow and steady. I deflected his suspicion by pretending I was just polishing the mantelpiece. "The dust is quite thick today, Mr. Oren," I said, my voice remarkably calm. He didn't move for a long time. Then he let out a long, slow breath and turned away. I managed to record his panic reaction secretly with my phone as he began packing the room, talking to himself. He was clearly rattled. He whispered to someone on his cell phone, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "I think she knows more than she should," he said into the receiver. "We need to deal with this now." Hearing those words sent a chill through me, but they also confirmed that my plan was working. He was no longer the confident millionaire. He was a man who knew the walls were closing in. I left the room as quickly as I could without looking like I was running. I knew that I had escaped by the skin of my teeth. Lucan's suspicion was at an all-time high, and I knew they would be watching my every move even more closely now. But I also knew that his panic would lead to mistakes. A man who is afraid is a man who makes errors. I just had to wait for him to slip up one last time. The following days were a blur of activity. Every document I could find, every video I could record, and every conversation I could overhear was captured and backed up. I was working on 4 different cloud accounts, ensuring that even if one was compromised, the others would remain safe. My arsenal of evidence was growing by the hour, and with it, my confidence was growing too. I no longer felt like a victim. I felt like a warrior. I walked through the halls of the mansion with my head held high, even when the family tried to belittle me. I knew something they didn't. I knew their end was coming. Their insults felt like mosquito bites, annoying, but ultimately harmless. I had the power to change their lives forever, and that knowledge was more satisfying than any paycheck. One morning, I found a threatening note tucked under my pillow. It didn't have a name on it, but the message was clear. "Stop now, or you won't like what happens next." It was a classic intimidation tactic, meant to make me feel unsafe in my own bed. But instead of scaring me, it only hardened my resolve. It was proof that they were desperate. They were out of options, and this note was a sign of their weakness, not their strength. I took a photo of the note and added it to my evidence file. Every attempt they made to silence me was just another piece of proof of their guilt. I realized that they were fighting a war they had already lost. They just didn't know it yet. I was the one holding all the cards, and I was waiting for the perfect moment to play them. The tension in the house was so thick you could feel it in your skin. The family was arguing more, their voices rising behind closed doors. They were starting to crack under the pressure of their own secrets. I stayed silent, a ghost in the machine, watching as their world began to fray at the edges. I was ready. The evidence was complete. Now it was time to let the world know the truth. I decided to start small. I wanted to see how they would react when their perfect image began to show its first cracks. I subtly leaked a few minor pieces of evidence, nothing that could be traced back to me, but enough to raise questions. I sent anonymous tips to a few local blogs and social media accounts, focusing on some of the smaller, legal inconsistencies in their charity work. The reaction was immediate. Lucan's reputation began to waver slightly as people started asking questions in the comments sections of their public posts. It wasn't a full-blown scandal yet, but the family was visibly unnerved. They weren't used to any kind of criticism. They were used to being worshipped, and seeing even a tiny bit of pushback was enough to send them into a tailspin. The best part was watching them turn on each other. Because they didn't know where the leaks were coming from, they started blaming each other. Regina accused Marcus of being sloppy with his emails. Marcus accused Alara of talking too much at parties. Lucan sat in the middle of it all, his face a mask of fury. Their unity, which was built on greed, was starting to crumble. I watched from the sidelines, serving tea and clearing plates while they shouted at each other. It was poetic justice. They had spent years manipulating everyone around them, and now they were being manipulated by the very truth they had tried to hide. The house was no longer a palace, it was a cage, and they were the animals inside. I knew I had to be careful not to reveal my hand too early. I wanted the pressure to build until they were at their most vulnerable. The minor leaks were just a test run, a way to see how they would handle a crisis. And based on what I was seeing, they were going to handle the final reveal very, very poorly. The stage was set, and the first act was over. Now it was time for the real drama to begin. As the minor leaks began to circulate more widely, the atmosphere in the Oren mansion turned from cold to explosive. Family arguments escalated from hushed whispers to full-blown screaming matches that could be heard from the servants' wing. No one was safe from their fury. Lucan, usually the calm center of the storm, began accusing the staff of disloyalty, firing 2 people on the spot for looking at him the wrong way. I stayed silent and invisible, observing everything. I moved through the house like a shadow, making sure I was never in the room when the tempers flared, but always close enough to record the fallout. I saw the way their fear was turning into madness. They were so busy looking for a mole among the staff that they didn't notice the person they should have been most worried about was the one cleaning their floors. One afternoon, I was polishing the banister near the top of the grand staircase when I heard Lucan talking to his lead head of security. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "Find the mole before it's too late," he ordered, his hand gripping the edge of his desk so hard the wood groaned. "I don't care what it takes. I want them gone." Hearing those words made my heart race, but I didn't let it show. I knew that they were getting closer, but I also knew that I was already miles ahead of them. They were looking for a thief or a spy, someone who looked like a threat. They weren't looking for a maid named Juna who had never missed a day of work and always had a polite word for everyone. I was ready for the final strike. The minor leaks had served their purpose, the public was curious, the family was divided, and the tension was at a breaking point. It was time to move from the shadows into the light. I had the evidence, the allies, and the plan. All I needed was the right moment to pull the trigger. and that moment was coming faster than any of them realized. It was time to escalate. I had gathered enough evidence to not just damage their reputation, but to destroy it. I carefully selected a group of the most damning files, videos of the fraud discussions, copies of the offshore bank records, and the recordings of their cruelty toward the staff. I sent this starter pack to an investigative journalist at a major national newspaper, keeping my identity completely hidden. The impact was almost instantaneous. Within 48 hours, small stories began to leak on major news sites. They weren't just rumors anymore. They were reported facts backed by anonymous sources. The headlines were brutal. The dark side of the Oren charity. And Millionaire dynasty under fire for financial discrepancies. The family panicked, their world spinning out of control. I watched as Lucan tried to bribe the staff to silence the rumors. He offered huge bonuses and loyalty contracts to anyone who would sign a statement saying the family was beyond reproach. It was a desperate move, and it only made them look more guilty. Most of the staff took the money but continued to whisper behind their backs. They knew the ship was sinking, and they were just trying to grab a life jacket before it went under. The mansion felt like it was under siege. Reporters were constantly calling, and protesters began to gather at the gates. The family was trapped inside their own wealth, unable to escape the scrutiny of the world they had tried so hard to impress. Every time I saw the news on the TV in the break room, I felt a surge of triumph. The truth was finally coming out. Despite the chaos, I continued to do my job. I served the burnt coffee and the cold meals, listening as they scrambled to find a way out. They were talking about fleeing the country, about hiding their assets in even more obscure accounts. But I was recording those conversations too. There was no escape for them. I had built a cage of their own making, and the door was about to lock forever. The news outlets finally picked up the story in full force. It was the lead segment on every evening broadcast. The charity lost all its credibility overnight, and donors began pulling their funding in droves. The Oren's business partners, who had once been so eager to be associated with them, were now issuing public statements distancing themselves from the family. The empire was crumbling in real time. Lucan's family scrambled to find a way to stop the bleeding. They hired expensive crisis management teams and high-priced lawyers, but no amount of money could change the facts. The evidence was too clear, too detailed, and too damaging. They were being hit from every angle, legal, financial, and social. Their carefully maintained facade was not just cracking, it was shattering into a million pieces. In the middle of the chaos, Lucan confronted me. He found me in the hallway, his face pale and his hands shaking. He looked older, smaller, as if the weight of his crimes was physically crushing him. He was unaware that I was the source of all his problems. He looked at me, or in my direction, and asked if I had seen anything unusual lately. He was looking for any clue, any hint of who was doing this to him. I stood there, looking at the man who had threatened me and belittled me for months. I felt a strange mix of emotions. I wasn't happy to see him suffer, but I was satisfied to see justice being served. I told him I hadn't seen anything and that I was just focused on my work. It was the last lie I would ever have to tell him. He sighed, a sound of pure defeat, and walked away. He looked like a ghost in his own house. I knew that the end was very near. The evidence was all out there, the authorities were moving in, and the world was watching. The calm before the storm was over, and the storm was finally here. I was ready to step out of the shadows and finish what I started. The house became eerily quiet. The shouting had stopped, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The family's internal distrust had reached its peak, and they barely spoke to each other anymore. They were like strangers living in the same mansion, each one waiting for the other to be the first to fall. Their facade was completely gone, leaving only the ugly truth behind. I refused to speak to anyone unless it was strictly necessary. I didn't want to give them any reason to suspect me in these final moments. I just did my work and waited. I could feel the energy in the air, the sense that something massive was about to happen. It was the same feeling you get right before a lightning strike. Lucan's lawyer arrived at the mansion late one night. I was clearing the table in the dining room when I heard him deliver the final blow. He warned Lucan that there was a potential whistleblower who had provided airtight evidence to the authorities. He told him that an arrest warrant was likely being prepared and that there was no way to stop it. The look on Lucan's face was one I will never forget. It was the look of a man who had finally realized he was not untouchable. His power, his money, his influence, it all meant nothing in the face of the truth. He looked around the room, his sightless eyes wide with a terror that no amount of wealth could cure. He was finally seeing the world for what it really was. I went back to my room and began to pack my few belongings. I didn't need much. I had my dignity, my integrity, and the knowledge that I had done the right thing. The story was almost over, and I was ready to walk away. The Oren family was about to face the consequences of their own greed, and I was going to be the one to watch them fall. The time had finally come for the exposure countdown. I spent the night preparing the final set of evidence, the most damning videos, the clearest admissions of guilt, and the most secret documents. I made sure every frame was airtight, every piece of data was verified, and every recording was time-stamped. This wasn't just a collection of secrets, it was a legal masterpiece. I sent the final package to the lead investigator at the Federal Bureau and to the head of the national news network. I included a letter explaining who I was and why I had done it. I didn't want to be a faceless source anymore. I wanted them to know that it was the invisible Maid who had brought them down. I wanted them to know that my name was Juna Barrett. The family was still in a state of high alert. They suspected me, but they couldn't prove it. They had searched my room, but they hadn't found anything because I had been too smart for them. They had watched me, but they hadn't seen anything because I had been too careful. They were living in a house of mirrors, and they were terrified of what they might see in the reflection. I woke up the next morning feeling lighter than I had in months. The sun was shining, and for the first time, the air in the mansion didn't feel cold. I knew that today was the day. I went down to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea, watching the clock as it ticked toward the moment of truth. The countdown was over. The evidence was in the hands of the people who could use it. The world was about to change for the Oren family, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt since the day I arrived. I had done what I came to do. Now, I just had to wait for the fireworks to begin. The reveal was perfect. At exactly 10:00 a.m., the evidence was released to the authorities and the press all at once. It was an explosion of information that dominated every news cycle. The videos of the family discussing fraud, the documents showing the offshore accounts, and the recordings of their cruelty were everywhere. The Oren Empire faced immediate audits, investigations, and a massive public backlash. The police arrived at the mansion shortly after noon. I was standing in the foyer when they walked through the front doors. They had warrants for Lucan, Regina, Marcus, and Alara. The family was led out in handcuffs, their faces pale and their eyes filled with shock. They looked like common criminals, which of course they were. As Lucan was being led toward the patrol car, he stopped and turned his head in my direction. In that moment, he finally realized the truth. He realized he had completely underestimated the Maid he thought was powerless. He didn't say anything, but the look of pure realization on his face was worth more than any amount of money. He finally saw me. The mansion was swarming with investigators, journalists, and curious onlookers. It was chaos, but it was a beautiful kind of chaos. It was the sound of justice being served. I stood in the middle of it all, calm and unshaken, watching as the world I had known for months was dismantled piece by piece. I felt a sense of vindication that I can't even describe. I had been right all along. The Orens were not the powerful gods they thought they were. They were just small, greedy people who had been caught in their own lies. And I was the one who had caught them. The Maid who tried too hard had finally succeeded, and the world would never be the same for any of us. The mansion, once a symbol of untouchable power, was now a house of chaos. The family members who weren't in custody immediately began to turn on each other, hearing separate lawyers and leaking their own secrets to try and save themselves. Legal battles exploded like fireworks, each one more damaging than the last. Their friends and staff deserted them in droves, not wanting to be associated with the sinking ship. Lucan lost control completely. His business partners withdrew their support, his charity was officially dissolved, and his bank accounts were frozen. The man who had once been the king of his world was now a prisoner of his own crimes. He was living in a nightmare of his own making, and there was no way to wake up. I watched from a distance, calm and unshaken. I had moved out of the mansion and into a small apartment in the city, but I still followed the news every day. Seeing them lose everything was satisfying, but more than that, it was a relief. The world was a safer place without their influence. The people they had hurt were finally getting the justice they deserved. The legal process was long and complicated, but the outcome was never in doubt. The evidence was too strong, the testimonies were too clear, and the public outcry was too loud. One by one, the Orens were convicted of their crimes and sentenced to years in prison. Their wealth was seized and used to pay back the people they had stolen from. The mansion and the empire would never feel safe to them again. Even if they ever got out of prison, they would be pariahs, ghosts of the people they once were. They had lost their reputation, their wealth, and their dignity. It was the ultimate revenge, not born out of my anger, but out of my commitment to the truth. I had won. I was publicly recognized as the whistleblower. My name was in the papers, and I was invited to speak on news programs about my experience. My integrity was praised by people all over the country. I was no longer Juna the maid. I was Juna Barrett, the woman who took down a dynasty. It was a strange and overwhelming feeling, but it was also incredibly empowering. Lucan attempted some desperate damage control from behind bars, trying to claim that I had fabricated the evidence or that I was motivated by greed. But no one believed him. His credibility was completely gone, and every attempt he made to smear me only made him look more desperate. The world had seen the truth, and there was no going back. I used my new platform to speak out for other domestic workers and employees who were being treated unfairly. I worked with lawmakers to create new protections for whistleblowers and to ensure that people in positions of power could no longer hide behind their wealth. I was turning my experience into something positive, something that could help others. The support I received was incredible. I got letters from people all over the world, thanking me for standing up for what was right. I even heard from some of my former colleagues at the Oren mansion, who told me how much my actions had meant to them. I wasn't just a hero in the eyes of the public. I was a hero to the people I had worked alongside every day. My life was changing in ways I never could have imagined. I was no longer invisible. I was seen, I was heard, and I was respected. I had proven that one person, even someone as insignificant as a maid, could change the world if they had the courage to tell the truth. I was finally free of the Oren family and their darkness, and the future was looking brighter than ever. I left the mansion grounds one last time, not as a servant, but as a victorious truth-bearer. I stood at the gates for a moment, looking back at the massive house that had been my prison for so many months. It looked smaller now, less imposing. It was just a building, a collection of stone and glass that could no longer hide the rot inside. My new life is independent, respected, and free. I have a job I love, a home that is my own, and a future that is entirely up to me. I no longer have to hide who I am or what I know. I can walk down the street with my head held high, knowing that I am a person of character and strength. I am no longer a ghost. I am a woman who made a difference. The Oren family struggles to survive the consequences of their own greed. They are gone, replaced by the justice they tried so hard to avoid. Their name is no longer a symbol of power, but a cautionary tale of what happens when you think you are above the law. They are a reminder that no matter how much money you have, you can never buy a clean conscience. Sometimes the blindest people are the ones who see nothing coming, and the quietest maid is the one who exposes everything. I have learned that true power doesn't come from a bank account or a title. It comes from the truth, and the truth, once it is told, can never be silenced. I walk away from the mansion, the sound of my footsteps firm and clear on the pavement. I don't look back. I am moving forward into a life that is my own. I have found my voice, and I will never let anyone take it away from me again. My name is Juna Barrett, and this is my story.